Hi, I'm Randall Westfall, pastor of Trinity Fellowship in Socorro and founder of Forerunner Ministries. We are embarking on a journey called Back to the Beginning. This is not designed to be a theological study as much as we would simply like to introduce to you some concepts that would be familiar to first century believers. So without any further ado, let's join the discussion.
Hi, we'd like to welcome our viewers back today, here with Forerunner Ministries and Randall Westfall and myself, Dina Van Dyke. And I know we're talking about covenant. So let's lead in with, last time we talked about we are Israel. We're no longer Jew or Gentile. And what does that mean, and how do we walk that out?
Well, that's really a good question, and I think it's one that has stumped us for many years. We've not really known what to do. Sometimes when we want to understand salvation, we put it in the context of Romans 10, 9, and 10, which our Bibles tell us is that when we believe in our heart and we confess with our mouth that God has raised Jesus from the dead, then we are saved. The idea of salvation in Hebrew is not a one-time, say a prayer kind of thing that many of our viewers would probably make that kind of identity with their own relationship with the Lord. Salvation from a Hebraic standpoint is being delivered from one's enemies, and that's why Paul said that he is working out his salvation with fear and trembling. You know, and I used to read that as a young believer and think, "Ugh, he's working out his salvation." I thought we had, you know, we were good to go once we had said that prayer, once we had made that commitment to follow the Lord, to walk with Him. And so, really, covenant is the idea of walking out your relationship with the Lord. For some of our viewers, that's a little bit of a abstract idea in terms of a spiritual relationship, but most often we put it in the context of a marriage because that's really what Abba intended for us to understand as Israel. Israel is the bride. It's not a group of people that He's made covenant with outside of Israel. It is Israel who is the bride, and that's why we need to understand and take on the identity of Israel, and then just simply walk in that. And so we've misunderstood some things. We've misapplied some things. We got some basic things right. We understood that we were sinners. We understood that Yeshua, or Jesus as we have known Him, is the Jewish Messiah, that He did go to the cross or to the execution stake on our behalf. He took my sin upon Him. And as if that wasn't enough of a load for Him to take, you know, He took on everyone else's as well. And so but now we need to understand Him on His terms. And so the idea is going beyond that, Romans 10, 9, and 10. What really is the context of walking in relationship with the Lord? What does it mean to walk in relationship with Him? Because Yeshua said when He was asked, you know, well, how are we supposed to walk this thing out? His answer was, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and to love your neighbors as yourself. So two key components of covenant is how then shall we live? How shall we walk with our Father in heaven, and how shall we walk with a corporate identity of believers in Yeshua as Israel? And so to go back to the covenant, when Yeshua came to this earth, He didn't say, I've come for the Gentiles. He didn't say, I've come for the Methodists or the Lutherans or the Buddhists or the Koreans. He said, I've come for the lost sheep of Israel. Huge clue there that we need to understand that His coming was to do something for Israel. And then the other piece of the puzzle, of course, is how do we tie the understanding of who Israel is back to the promise to Abraham, our father in the faith? Because the promise to Abraham was that every family in the earth would have an opportunity to be grafted in. In our English Bibles, that it's usually translated that through Abraham, every family in the earth would be blessed. But what that word blessed there means in the Hebrew is grafted in. Grafted into the covenant people. So we have to go back then to an understanding of what covenant is he talking about.
Right.
Because in our last couple of shows, we discussed Paul's writings, and he doesn't refer to a covenant. He refers to the covenants, plural. So what does that entail? So an understanding from a Hebraic mind is that Abraham was the first covenant. The Mosaic covenant was a new cycle. The promise was to Abraham. So in order to become a son of Abraham, one must have faith, just like Abraham did. The Mosaic covenant was one that required obedience. So now we understand that cycle 1 is faith,
Right.
cycle 2 is obedience, cycle 3, in the context of Paul's writings, would be the Messianic covenant, the renewed covenant. In our English Bibles, it's usually the new covenant, but that word in Hebrew again is renewed. And so the picture is like the moon. If you were to say to me, "Hey, Randall, there's a new moon tonight," and I would go, is there a different moon? Or is it the same moon that has entered into a new cycle? Well, the obvious answer is that it's not a different moon. It's the same moon. So from a Hebraic understanding, we want our viewers to really understand that you have to look at the covenants, plural, in terms of the cycles in which they were implemented. Yeshua says, it's recorded in the Gospels, that he ratifies the new covenant or the renewed covenant, or what I like to refer to as the Messianic covenant, with his blood. And so in the context of that, he sits around a table. You and I are sitting at a table today. Once a year, we are instructed in Abba's word to remember when he brought the Israelites out of Egypt. And on the 14th day of the first month on the biblical calendar, we are to tell our children and our grandchildren the story of coming out of Egypt. Now, that obviously happened thousands of years ago. And so a practical application for us today is for us to tell our children and grandchildren how Abba brought us out of our own Egypt. Because each and every one of us who are believers in Yeshua have come from somewhere. Right. We have come from a place that was bondage, that was broken, that was, a place of wounding, a place of disappointment, a place of despair for some. And we just have an understanding today that represents the world. Egypt really represents the world, that we've come out of the world. We're hopeful we've completely come out of the world, though that in itself is a process, isn't it? And so understanding covenant is important for us because I think all of us would agree that God is a God of covenant. So if he is in fact a God of covenant, then what covenant would we walk in? What was Yeshua talking about that day that he sat with his disciples and he said, as often as you do this, which was a Passover Seder, as often as you do this, you remember, you go back, you tell your children, your grandchildren what happened. And furthermore, what he required of them was that they were to take of bread and they were to take unleavened bread. And they were to take of the wine. They were to there was a ritual that was symbolic. This was not done weekly. This was done annually. Some of our viewers may recognize the elements of bread and wine or bread and juice as the elements that we would call communion. Yeah. But Yeshua said, as often as you do this. And he was at a Passover Seder, one time a year, on the 14th day of the first month on the biblical calendar. And what was required of the disciples was the same thing that was required at the tabernacle in Moses' day. And that is, you had to partake, the priests in the tabernacle had to partake of the animal that was sacrificed on their behalf so that their sin could be atoned for. So they had to place that sacrifice on the altar, and then they had to partake of that sacrifice. Yeshua was teaching the very same principle in the context of what he was doing at that Passover Seder. He was telling his disciples, you must partake of that which atoned for your sin, or in Yeshua's case, actually caused the remission of sin. Mm-hmm. That's why we do the Passover Seder annually. It is our annual renewal of our vow of betrothal to the God of Israel. And so we take of the unleavened bread, which the bread is unleavened because it represents a bread that is without sin. Leaven represents sin. And just an analogy, leaven is not a bad product, but it represents, in spiritual terms, I mean, we like leaven in our bread, do we not? We like bread that has been raised. Yes. So it's not an evil thing, but it represents sin in the context of a spiritual analogy. And so so the idea here is to put back things into the context in which the people in the first century would have understood it. Because the book that we call the New Testament, the letters from Paul, the writings from Luke, and the Gospels, we call that the Messianic writings or the apostolic writings in the Messianic world. But by and large, we've all historically known them as the New Testament. What we're trying to do is just help us really get to the bottom of what did they believe, and why did they believe what they believed. Yeah. So Hebrews chapter 8 and chapter 9 tell us that doctrine in the first century was that the covenant that Yeshua ratified on that night before he went to the execution stake is the renewed covenant of Jeremiah 31:31. Mm-hmm. That covenant was not made with any group of people other than the 12 tribes of Israel. Mm-hmm. That's why Yeshua came for the lost sheep of Israel. If you come from a Gentile family, do not be concerned. His invitation to come into covenant is still available to you, but it's not available to you outside of Israel, because the covenant is with Israel. Now, the promise to Abraham was that every family in the earth could come into covenant by being grafted in. So last time we talked a little bit about, we ran short on time, but we talked a little bit about the olive tree, and that Israel, the physical descendants of Israel who do not come to faith in Yeshua as Messiah will be cut out of that olive tree. And that the Gentiles who come to faith in Yeshua will be grafted into that tree. And once you come in as a wild olive, it only takes 3 days for you to start producing the fruit of the original cultivated olive tree. So Paul teaches very clearly that as Gentiles, we are citizens of Israel. We have the full rights of a citizen. And that was important teaching in that day because they were under Roman rule. Yeah. And there was a big difference between being a Roman citizen and not being a Roman citizen. Your rights as a Roman citizen were far greater than if you were not a Roman citizen. So the whole concept of being a citizen of an entity of the spiritual nature of the tribes of Israel was a phenomenal thing. Some people kind of ho-hum today, but it was something in that time would have been very impactful. Yeah, definitely. To be grafted in, to be adopted as a son into the family of God. An amazing thing. And so for our viewers, it's important for you to understand that you are welcome to come in to the covenant made with Israel. Now, even in Jewish teaching, that's somewhat vague and nebulous. In some Jewish circles, not all, but in some Jewish circles, they really don't, this whole idea of the Gentiles coming into the covenant, really not sure. They're really not sure that that's what Abba intended, and that's why Paul fought so diligently. And that's why he debated Peter. That's why he made sure that it was abundantly clear in his writings to the congregations in which he served as apostle. He was abundantly clear that you are not going to, I'm not a man pleaser, you're not going to be a man pleaser. I want you to please God. So how do you do that? He said the one doctrinal truth that every congregation must have in place is foundational, is that you keep God's commandments. The other stuff, seemed to have application in certain places because Paul was teaching his children. He was teaching his children, and as a parent, if you have more than one child, you quickly learn that second child doesn't always react in the same way that the first child did, and that the discipline may be more effective if you use some different techniques. And so you learn over time, and you adjust and you adapt because you want the very best for your children. Paul wants the very best for us. Even today, as he was writing, he had to have known that there was some prophetic fulfillment in his writings that would come well after he passed from life on this earth. And so today we're wrestling with this whole issue so that we can understand it in the context in which he meant it. It is important for us to really understand how we define things, because when we define things incorrectly, if we define things just based on what we were taught in Sunday school, some of those concepts may have been right, some of them may not have been right, and over time, most of us have not been in one congregation all of our spiritual lives.
Sure.
Some of us have moved from city to city. Some of us have been very sure that when we do move, that we stay within the same denomination, if you will. But, a Presbyterian church in Los Angeles may not look like a Presbyterian church in, Kingman, Arizona, or Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so, a lot of the personality of that congregation is going to come forth from the leaders of that congregation and the pastor of that congregation. And so, I have, in my travels as an adult, having lived in several different parts of the country, I have found that in one place, this denomination, which I found to be a wonderful, loving home here, over here not so much, and I began to look for another place to plug in, to build community. And that place that I found to plug in may have a completely different view of some doctrinal truth. And for most of us, it was not so much about the doctrine as much as it was just we wanted to be in a place where we felt loved and accepted and wanted. And so we want the best of both worlds. We want to be loved and accepted, but we also want to make sure that we're doctrinally true to Scripture.
Definitely. I just want to come back to a word because the word keeps coming to you when you talk about the renewed covenant. I think so many times we don't look at that. It's like it was a new covenant. But when you look back at the original text and talking about renewed covenant, it goes further.
It does go further. And most of us have grown up in places where the whole Old Testament idea was kind of poo-pooed. We no longer are subject to the Old Testament. Now, there's some things in there we knew we could learn. There were some spiritual principles that we knew we could learn from the characters of the Bible, so to speak.
There's more stories.
And we loved the Psalms. We found comfort in the Psalms. We found encouragement in the Psalms. We found, that Proverbs could teach us things that were profound. We love Deuteronomy 28, the blessings. Not so fond of what comes after that, in terms of the curses. But I've sat in many a sermon hearing someone talk about Deuteronomy 28 and never heard it put in the context of these promises are connected to following Torah, being obedient to Torah. They were, in essence, taken out of context. And so, it's really important to us at Forerunner Ministries and also with our partner ministry, Olive Tree Fellowship in Albuquerque, that we put things back into the proper context.
Yeah. So exciting, and it's good that we look at that and find the real truth, I think. And if there are people out there seeking the truth, they're going to find it there.
We certainly hope that you will, and we understand that in these 30-minute shows, we're not able to go into deep theological. I can't expound upon Scripture to the extent that I would like in order to explain it to people. So I want to encourage you, get into a life-giving community. If you're in the Albuquerque area, you just simply need to give us a call. Our phone number is on the screen. You can go to our website, get some information about us. You can email me. That information is also on your screen. You can come to one of our studies. We study Torah in Albuquerque. We study Torah in Los Lunas. We study Torah in Socorro. We are now getting invitations to go other places. And so, we want to help you be able to discern, what is the truth that I've been taught, and what are some ideas of man that maybe were not really biblically centered, so that we can walk in truth, because it's going to become increasingly more important for our viewers to understand in the days ahead, as pressure builds, as we see the Middle East unfold, as we see our nation stand with Israel or fail to stand with Israel, that there are some changes coming. There are some challenges coming, and you really need to know what you believe, but you also need to know why you believe it, because just knowing what you believe isn't going to get you there when the times are really, really tough.
If I can go back, Randall, you were talking and sharing with the viewers of walking in truth. Earlier you talked about what it is to really walk in covenant. So how do we walk that out?
Well, that's a good question, and we're still working on that, Dina. We're still working on that. But we understand Yeshua's instructions to us first and foremost were that if you love me, keep my commandments. The word keep there in the Hebrew understanding is more than just to do them. It is to guard them. It is to cherish them. It is to honor the whole concept of love, of compassion, of mercy. And we've been taught by people who meant well but really didn't understand that we don't live under the law anymore, we live under grace. Well, the very meaning of grace in a Hebraic understanding is covenant. It literally in the Paleo Hebrew is a picture of the word that we translate as grace most often, Hanan in Hebrew. And again, I'm not very good at pronouncing Hebrew words. But I got in the ballpark anyway. It is a picture of pitching a tent. It is our Father's tent. It is a safe place. It is the idea of mercy bringing you to the tent door. Mercy being, here you are out in the wilderness. Perhaps you're in the wilderness because you've chosen a life of sins. Perhaps you're in the wilderness because you just have broken relationships and you don't know how to repair them. But you're out there in the wilderness, and he keeps wooing you to him. He keeps bringing you back to the tent door because he wants you to make a choice. He's not going to make the choice for you. And how painful that must be. And yet he doesn't override our will. He gives us free will. He gives us the opportunity to choose him. He gives us the opportunity to not choose him. So the idea of walking in covenant really is that we come to that tent door and we have to make a choice. Will I step inside the tent? Will I come into this safe place where his instructions provide me a community where I know that I'm loved, I am cherished, there are people who have my back, and that he can protect me because I'm within the boundaries of his protection. I'm not stepping out to outside of his protection. And the concept is, our viewers would know from what we call the book of James, which is, his name is really not James, his name is Jacob. But he taught the concept that if you submit to God and resist the enemy must flee. Well, two things have to happen before he must flee. First of all, you have to submit to God. And secondly, then you have to resist. How do we resist? We follow Abba's instructions. That's how we resist him.
Yeah.
How did Yeshua resist him in the wilderness? He said, "It is written," and he quoted Scripture.
Yeah.
And so, how do we do it? Well, I would use Yeshua as the perfect example. Submit to his instructions and follow them, and make sure that the enemy understands your intent is to follow Abba's instructions. And so, until we do that, he doesn't flee.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And sometimes believers are really frustrated with the day-to-day dealing with stuff, and we really need to go back and say, are we doing step one?
Yeah.
Have we submitted to his instructions? They're not suggestions.
Right.
They're instructions. And secondly, have we destroyed the authorities that are trying to bring chaos into our lives? Have we taken authority over those demonic influences? And so walking in covenant really involves us making a commitment in the same way that you would expect a spouse to make a commitment to you. Our Father in heaven has a reasonable expectation that we will make a like commitment, that we will be faithful, that we will be loyal, that we will keep our promises, that we will not chase after other idols, that we will not follow after other gods, but that we will simply put him first. And when we fail to do that, that we simply repent and come back.
Exactly.
And so stepping into the tent requires bringing a sacrifice. The sacrifice obviously is not something that you and I can do because we've not lived perfect lives. Well, I won't speak for you, but speaking for myself, I've not lived a perfect life. And so I can't be that sacrifice. I can't be that righteous one. But I have someone who did that for me. And he furthermore not only did that for me, but he invited me to come and partake of that which was shed on my behalf and to live eternally with our Father in heaven. It's astounding to me.
It is, very much so. Well, I know with that we have to close. We only have a couple seconds here. So, Randall, thank you so much for sharing that today. And I'd like to say thank you to our viewers. And until we meet next time here with Forerunner Ministries.
Shalom, shalom. We are so appreciative of the fact that you have tuned in today. In addition to that, if you feel led to make a financial contribution to help keep this program going in the future, we would ask that you would send an offering to Post Office Box 624, Socorro, New Mexico, 87801. Please make your check or money order to Forerunner Ministries. Have a blessed day, and we hope to see you next week.